Standard 1 is about content knowledge, about knowing and using and assessing technology. I started off with that in EdTech 502, where we had to code websites. It was the first time I had ever coded anything, and I learned a lot from the class, but there were definitely moments where it blew my mind. And while I don't code on a daily basis, it still taught me, first of all, how to consider how I create any sort of format online. I think about the color coordination. Do things go together pleasantly? Do I use fonts to emphasize information specifically? Is it clearly organized? Not only has it impacted the way I create websites online, but it's also impacted the way that I organized regular text that I'm working with. I had the ability, the luxury maybe, of using the information that I learned from my multimedia class to create a video that would be used in my classroom. So we learned about things like the personalization principle and coherence principle, about not using distracting pieces of information, whether it's sound or pictures, only using what is useful, and then to create a video that would instruct my students to actually use what I'd learned. And this video about how to write a specific type of paragraph, which we use as our essay responses, is something that I use regularly in my classroom. One last thing that we studied that I used was I had to evaluate how my school uses technology, which I had thought about how my classroom uses technology, but not about how that expanded onto my department and in my school building and then into my district. I assessed the different ways that we use it in curriculum, the different ways that it is technology is used to administrate paperwork, like emergency medical forms. So it was a new way of thinking about technology for me. Standard 2 is about content pedagogy, about knowing what my students know, about knowing about teaching students, and how to use technology to impact that. For a kind of a foundational level in 502, I created a website about the constitutional monarchy in England because, frankly, it's something my students struggle with. I wanted to create, they had a textbook that's got all sorts of information, but I really wanted to create a source that was concise, that was pared down, that had the basics, that helped guide them to some locations where they could find information about the specific leaders because they struggle with the Jameses and the Charleses. And so I was able to use technology as a way to help them learn content that I knew they struggled with. One way that I was able to use technology to really transform a process was the process of the research paper. I created an online course for our banned book research paper for American literature. And back in the day, I used note cards and looked in books and had paper that I deleted and crossed out. And this online course really used technology to transform that process of creating a research paper, where my students would create their thesis statement through a worksheet that they did on Google Docs. And then it also directed them to creating their annotated bibliography through Noodle Tools, which is an online website where they were able to export their annotated bibliography in perfect format, which is something I really could have used in some of the classes that I took and some of the papers that I wrote. So both of these show how I was able to use technology to change student learning, to add it to what I already knew about how the students learn and what they struggled with in my classroom. Standard 3 was about learning environments and creating and using them and evaluating them. And I think that there are two activities that I did that were connected to each other based off of what I learned through my EdTech classes. The first one was creating a instructional design for EdTech 503. And I chose infographic. My students had been working on a genocide project for world history, and I was challenging them to present their data, the information they gathered about this genocide, in a visual way that would help clarify the information for their viewers. They struggled with it. And so when I had the opportunity to create an instructional design, I chose that. And clear down to the learning materials and the students' prior knowledge, it really led me to look at the instruction of the infographic very clearly and very organized. Even having a friend, a colleague, evaluate it to help me figure out areas of improvement. I had a good instructional design. And then I took the multimedia class. And I realized that while I had a really good instructional design for creating an infographic for my students, that it was really geared towards me as the instructor and not them as the student. So as I considered the different principles that we learned in multimedia, I created a presentation that would take the students clearly, without distraction, without unnecessary music or any sort of images that were distracting, how they could go through and create an infographic for their presentation. So not only did I, at the end of both of these classes, have a good instructional design, I also had a good product that would clearly instruct my students on what they needed to know. Standard 4 is about professional knowledge and skills, and it has my favorite wording, my favorite phrase of any of our standards, when it's talking about creating technology-rich learning within a supportive community of practice. And I like that phrase. I think that it is something that was eye-opening. That idea of a community of learners has been something I've always been concerned in my classroom, but I've thought about it differently because of my classes. And it started out with a very low-tech kind of assignment, and that was my synthesis proposal, where I studied the constructivist approach to teaching social studies. Social studies can be a very traditional class with a teacher at the front lecturing while students frantically write notes. But there's a changing way of looking at social studies where the student's voice becomes so important in telling the story of history and how they relate to history. And as I considered that new way of thinking about technology and the student's voice and the content that I needed to cover, it led to me creating a genocide project for my world history students. For 12 weeks while we're studying the 20th century, within that time, they are, for bits, working on a genocide that they have chosen. And they have to create a project. They have to have an annotated bibliography. There are parts that they need to do, and they get to choose what they're doing and how they're going to present it. The problem, I think, is within that question of, what's my job then? If the students are doing the learning themselves, then what do I do? And I found that my job is the facilitator, that I am the one who creates the framework, who I end up creating these checkpoints where I help the students know what they need to know, when they need to get it done, what the expectations are, what the goals are, where they should be, where they're going, and to really help them through that. So the course of this study about constructivism has really changed the way that I'm teaching social studies and is helping me help my students find their voice. Standard 4 is about research, and I did research throughout the course of the classes that I took. Within multimedia, I studied the coherence principle and what it meant and what the research was about it, but then also down to, okay, now that I've studied it, how do I use it? How can I use it better in my classroom so that only the most necessary information is presented to my students with no distracting elements? I did an annotated bibliography as I was studying constructivism and trying to figure out how that changed or would change the way that I taught history. But I think that of the research that I did, one of the activities, one of the ways that I really used my research was in the PBL unit I did for the project-based learning class. It was about anthropology and the Puritans. We really wanted our students in American literature to figure out what the lives of the Puritans were like beyond just trying to understand what the text meant. We wanted them to see the impact that those people ended up having later on American history and in the lives that we had today. So this course required me to come up with what the products and the performances that I was going to use to have an organized plan that included both personal reflection, group projects, meetings with the teacher. I had to have an organized timeline of events, but I think maybe what I really liked the most was the learning guide, because it was a way for me to connect the targets that I had for my students with the ways that I was going to assess it and with what that was hoping to teach my students, and to create it all together, frankly, in a really contained website so that I could share it with my other teachers and that we could all use it together. So I was able to use the research that I had done about learning and about how to use technology in a very clear way in this this PBL.